My name is Tomasz Falkowski. Right now, I'm an assistant professor in the Honors College at the University of New Mexico. But a lot of the work that I'm going to present here was completed while I and my colleagues were at New Mexico Highlands University. And then also some of the folks that have participated in this have been involved in the Quivira Coalition and also Mississippi State University. So with that, I do just want to say thank you to everyone who participated in this project, or rather these projects. It's a even though I'm the one presenting right now, this is really a collaborative endeavor, and I could not have done it by myself. So I just want to thank everyone who has been helpful in participating and really providing valuable contributions. So to get started, I'm going to just sort of rush through a lot of this because I think my suspicion is that a lot of folks in the audience will already know at least something about the history of forest and management, and particularly fuels management here in New Mexico. And that has changed significantly over time, right? There's a rich history of indigenous cultural burning here in northern New Mexico. And then after colonization, we have industries such as timber extraction, grazing, really altering fuel loads in our forests here in northern New Mexico. And what you can see here from the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research at the University of Arizona, and this is true broadly across the Intermountain West. This is also certainly true for us here in northern New Mexico. You can see starting around 1900, there is a marked downturn in the number of fires, of wildfires here. And that's associated with a number of causes that I'll get into in just a second. But the result of that, or one of the results of that, has been an accumulation of forest fuels, as you can see in this picture of the Pecos River here. This is a fairly recent picture, I want to say back in 1980, and the same one back just prior to the right around the turn of the century, again in the early 1900s. So you can see a dramatic increase in the amount of trees there, and in turn fuels. Now, a lot of that is associated with the Big Burn of 1910, which killed about 100 people. Several towns were destroyed and burned about 3 million acres. And this is really when the federal agencies started implementing this policy of fire suppression, right? So we have rules where we say, all right, within 24 hours of a fire being reported, we want it to be controlled. We see a lot of suppression activity. And this has sort of increased moving into the modern day as a lot of construction. And this is not a recent picture. Someone I think may have added an annotation, or I did. I'm going to try to clear that if possible. I don't quite know how. So sorry about that little red squiggle on the screen. Yeah, I can't quite seem to clear off the annotation.
I'll see
But
if I
at
can
any
do it.
rate, okay, thank you. We see an increase in construction, particularly in that wildland urban interface, and a lot of suppression activities resulting as a consequence of that, because very reasonably people don't want their properties to burn. And then in northern New Mexico, one of sort of the flashpoints, if you'll excuse the pun, it came around 1991 when timber extraction became increasingly limited. That sort of corresponded with the spotted owl injunction. But really, and that certainly did not help. But arguably, this was sort of a nail in a coffin of a process that was already underway. Timber extraction had been slowing in northern New Mexico primarily because timber growth in New Mexico is slower and, as a consequence, less profitable than other regions. We just couldn't necessarily compete economically, and so a lot of the timber extraction industry went elsewhere. But ultimately, even though the spotted owl may have been sort of this final nail in the coffin, as I mentioned, this is part of a conflict over land management that has long been simmering. These are new issues, but old wounds, essentially because we see through a process of privatization and also a lot of legal action, the transfer of land from land grant communities in northern New Mexico, Hispano communities that went back to the Spanish colonial time, to private landowners, and then ultimately then to the United States Forest Service. And even though that transfer wasn't necessarily direct, right? It isn't necessarily that the Forest Service took the land directly from the land grant members. There, that action is not very distant and quite sort of relevant in people's minds here in northern New Mexico. And the result of all of this, I had that picture early on of fuel accumulation, is that we are now seeing bigger and more intense fires here in northern New Mexico, as is true for most of the Intermountain West. And certainly climate change here is the big factor that is exacerbating issues. 2024 being the first year that we had 1.5 Celsius above pre-industrial levels throughout the entire year. And so, this is something that we are now very much in the midst of. This is not necessarily future projections anymore. Now, when it comes to managing fire in our forests, I think it's useful, at least for me, to think about the fire triangle, sort of the three elements that are necessary to ignite and sustain fire, those being oxygen, heat, and fuel. Now, oxygen can't necessarily control. I think, John Stewart had a thing about putting a big cloche and limiting oxygen. It's probably not going to be a very viable solution since we also tend to depend on it for other things. Heat and ignition, there's some things that we can do, right? We can place restrictions on fire usage and behaviors in wildland areas. But, ultimately there's certain sources of ignition that we cannot control. Arguably the one that's easiest and most within our grasp to control is the fuel part of this equation. And we're doing this a lot by thinning forest, reducing fuel loads, removing fuel ladders. But then there's the question of, okay, what now do we do with the slash that is resulting from these thinning operations? And prescribed burns are certainly an option, be they pile burns or broadcast burns, things like that. But the reality is that when it comes to federal agencies, most resources are still being devoted primarily towards suppression, which is making our forests less resilient. There's not a whole lot of resources available to actually implement safely these prescribed burns and sort of work through the backlog of fuels that have been accumulating over the last century. And then furthermore, when we've got the intersection of prescribed fire and the climate crisis, there is certain issues that arise as weather becomes more volatile, more extreme, and these prescribed, we don't use the term controlled burns, but the prescribed burns are more difficult to control ultimately. And so we see an example of that here in northern New Mexico that has certainly imbued people with a lot of uneasiness about the very necessary prescribed burns. And so for folks, again, who aren't from northern New Mexico, I think anyone who is from here knows this story all too well. But this was really two fires that turned into a complex, both of which were the result of prescribed fires, ultimately breached the control lines and burned almost 350,000 acres of northern New Mexico, a lot of that at high severity, damaged and destroyed about 1,000 structures, really impact, and the legacy of this is still being felt. Right. People's water systems are being affected. Our irrigation systems for agriculture are being impacted. And so this is a very present thing people's memory, that sort of limits the cultural viability of prescribed fire. It's a much bigger hurdle to overcome in terms of getting public engagement and public support for these prescribed burns. And this is one of the potentials where, so now we're getting finally to biochar, where biochar is often promoted as an alternative to prescribed fire to treat the slash from thinning. And it's one of these things that in many ways is like a three-way win, because on the one hand, we're treating that slash, we're reducing wildfire risk. We are improving ecosystem health. The biochar is an extraordinarily recalcitrant form of carbon. It is going to have residence times in soils for centuries to millennia, so an order of magnitude more than a lot of other types of organic matter. And it's improving water holding capacity. It also has the potential to treat a lot of the sort of fuels that wouldn't otherwise have a lot of economic value, right? So most biochar is produced with small diameter fuel wood, so it's not something that people would use for timber or even from some of the specialty wood products that we have here in northern New Mexico, like Vigas or Latias or something like that. This is sort of really hoping to address some of the wood that wouldn't be used in other places. And then finally, right, I mentioned that carbon is extraordinarily recalcitrant. This is a drawdown technology where we can be integrating that carbon into the soil and functionally into the geologic carbon pool, right? So lot of benefits. And I should say that although biochar has gotten a lot of hype recently, this is not a new technology, right? This is based on traditional ecological knowledge. So there's an image here of terra preta, or Amazonian dark earths. And so indigenous peoples in the Amazons and presumably the Americas have been amending soils. And I say, presumably, I think it's most notable in the Amazon because often we're dealing with very nutrient poor, highly weathered oxasols and ultisoil soil types. So to see that transition is very obvious. And these are, developed centuries, if not millennia ago, and they are still extraordinarily fertile, especially by contrast to what was there prior to the soil amendment with biochar. And so here we've got an image, a series of images showing a small scale biochar production process. This is the Ring of Fire, Kelpie Wilson, I think out of I forget if it's Oregon State or University of Oregon, but she produces these, and essentially we see these small diameter pieces of wood. This is a top lit updraft kiln, so it's top lift. We see the actual burning. It should note that, depending on the technology that you're using, yes, you are applying fire. The process, the sort of physiochemical process here is of pyrolysis, which actually converts the biomass to biochar, is distinct from combustion. And although certainly there is combustion happening in a lit updraft kiln like this, it's shifting towards pyrolysis. And if you get into more sort of controlled technologies, retort kilns and things like that, where you are not necessarily combusting the material, you see more pyrolysis, greater biochar conversion efficiency from biomass, but you still get the same end product, which is this biochar here, that you can see us raking out after quenching this particular burn, and then that can be applied to the soil. And we had a number of key questions here. One was, all right, so biochar seems like this great strategy, especially for us here in northern New Mexico, right? We can improve our soil water holding capacity in our semi-arid climate. We can improve soil health, where oftentimes soil health is a limiting factor for ecological productivity. We can mitigate carbon emissions, reduce fuel loads, and yet it's not really being widely adopted. And we were most interested in land managers here, or private land managers in our study, just because that was sort of the group with whom we were working most closely in the wake of Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon. But ultimately, I think there's also a similar sort of lack of adoption in agencies as well. And then second, okay, so what are those barriers? How could we help overcome them to expand the scope of biochar production in northern New Mexico? So essentially, what are the problems? What could be done to address them? And we looked at the literature, and a lot of the biochar literature tends to focus on biophysical factors. And there's a lot of sort of presumption about sort of economic barriers, that sort of thing. But it turns out when you actually look at, okay, there's a lot of assumptions going into that. What do people say when you actually ask them? Not a whole lot of research, and a lot of that has been on the application side of things. So almost all the studies we were looking at were on farmers who would be applying the biochar to their fields to improve the productivity of their fields. Not a whole lot on the production side of things. And a lot of it is in a very different sort of socioeconomic context than we have here in northern New Mexico. But in general, the two biggest barriers, which all three of the studies identified, were a lack of knowledge or education or understanding, and then cost, right? So there's sort of knowledge and cost. And we want to see, okay, that's what they found. What about around here? And so we did a mixed methods research project combining surveys and interviews. And we then did both qualitative analysis on the interview data and then quantitative data analysis on the survey data. And again, here you can see a map of the study region where we were considering. So we really focused on sort of that enchanted circle area here in northern New Mexico. Just a quick overview of who actually participated. And, with any sort of social science study, so much of the results are need to be contextualized in the people who actually participated. And that will inform how representative the study is for the broader population. And when we look at our respondents, they tended to be slightly skewed towards older males, middle and higher income folks, even though we had a pretty equal racial split. It's not necessarily reflective of that broader population. So all of the results that we have need to sort of be placed in that context. But I still think that a lot of this is relevant. We do some breakdown in the next slides, looking at if we sort of look at particular demographic groups, are there differences? And there are some differences, but the overall message I think is fairly consistent. So the first thing that we were sort of surprised with right off the bat is that most of the people who we spoke to were in fact aware, at least, of biochar, right? They knew it existed as a potential strategy for land management. That's not necessarily true, what was found with that past research. But what we also see is that even though a majority of our respondents are actually aware of it, the vast minority are actually producing it. Only about 13%, or only 13% are producing it. So we've got a little bit of a gap, right, between awareness and then actually implementing the land management strategy. And when we looked at people's motivations, what would be useful to sort of incentivize people, a lot of people focused on the biophysical benefits. And this was also borne out in the interviews, where people saw really, water holding capacity, improving soil quality. They were really motivated by that querencia that we talk about here in northern New Mexico, a desire to promote ecological health and caring for the land. And this was really sort of contextualized and rooted in place, because the top benefits, right, even though ecological benefits were all there, water, nutrient holding capacity, fuel load reduction, those were the main ones that people really gravitated towards. But then when we asked them, okay, so that's why you would produce biochar, why are you not doing it? And the biggest barriers were knowledge-based, and then lack of access to expensive equipment. So information, as many of us know, is difficult to access, both physically, so sort of the folks in rural northern New Mexico are both physically and socially isolated, right? Oftentimes, so that's difficult. Broadband access is not necessarily reliable, that sort of thing. The other thing that we found was that fire was sort of this double-edged sword in people's minds. Because on the one hand, people really recognized, okay, biochar, we're producing this broadly, typically in some sort of contained environment, in some sort of kiln or something like that. So there's sort of less risk than a pile burn even. But people were still freaked out about it. Any sort of use, especially in the wake of Hermit's Peak Half Canyon, people were concerned about the fire getting out of control, about the potential liability that they had, and the devastation that could result from it. So sort of anytime fire as a management tool was mentioned, even in this very controlled environment, there was concern about it. And then the other one that people mentioned, economic burdens, right? A lot of people just said, look, I'm not looking to make money necessarily, but I can't just do this sort of out of the goodness of my heart. There has to be some sort of incentives. And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment. And then tied in with that, they weren't necessarily interested in navigating institutions to get any sort of economic incentives, right? I think a lot of people were, and this has been exacerbated with Hermit's Peak Half Canyon, with a lot of people's challenges interfacing with FEMA to get payments from them. But essentially complicated paperwork, slow processing, needing to navigate labyrinthine bureaucracies. All of these are very major barriers to folks. And there's also a lot of institutional distrust that they would have to overcome in the first place, right? People find it fairly top down. There's a lot of sort of historic baggage that is associated with these institutions that are advocating for biochar. And so people are a little bit reticent to engage. And so in thinking about next steps, ensuring knowledge and making sure that it's equally accessible. We found that hands-on activities, so workshops, field days, that sort of things, those were by far the most popular and also the most equitable. So when we broke that down by both income and race, those were things that everybody tended to gravitate towards. Disadvantage, poor, and respondents of color. And this really needs to be led by organizations that already have a good amount of trust. So organizations like Soil and Watershed Conservation District, NGOs, right? Certain organizations, folks are just not going to touch with a 10-foot pole, right? So if the Forest Service is necessarily advocating for this, that already people are viewing with a degree of skepticism. And that, can be an opportunity to build trust and build up that relationship. But the reality is that a lot of people took a very dim view of information and programs from certain institutions. And then finally, people mentioned a lot about some sort of cost sharing opportunities. So things like cooperatives or centralized production so that they could bring the slash to, say, a site where the pyrolysis would happen, but they wouldn't necessarily each have to go out and buy their own kiln or something like that. Which then sort of leads to the follow-up question is like, okay, so there's this interest in these somewhat centralized biochar production facilities. Where would be a good place to put them, given sort of biophysical and socioeconomic factors? And so again, we looked at the literature. Again, there's a huge focus on application of biochar in an agricultural context rather than a production context in forests and woodland landscapes. And so we decided to use a fairly common approach, which is multi-criteria evaluation models that would integrate a number of different factors for both biochar production and application, right? Because we're not just, when we're trying to cite these locations, we're not just interested in, okay, if we're bringing slash there, that's a big factor, but we also want to deposit that biochar in places that would be, provide ecological benefits. And so we were looking at things like soil characteristics, right? Where would be the biggest marginal benefit in terms of soil carbon? Where is the pH? So biochar tends to be pretty alkaline, right? So we don't want to be adding it to places that already have alkaline soils. What about areas that could benefit from improved water holding capacity? We also were looking at where we could be getting the biomass from to actually process that into biochar. And then we looked at a couple of factors like roads, things that would facilitate transportation, things like that. Both to sort of allow us to calculate costs regarding transport and storage. And so the first thing, we found potential sites that met certain minimum conditions, and then we looked at which could be winnowing that down based on the factors, which would be best for a moderate scale operation, which I forget the order of magnitude. I should have looked at this before the presentation. I think it was less than 1,000 metric tons. It could have been 10,000 metric tons. I'm not 100% sure. So if anyone is interested in the publication, I just email me and I'll be happy to share it. And then also large scale production, so sort of more industrial scale pyrolysis. And so you can see sort of our initial potential suite of sites that met minimum qualifications. Then we've got our 20 best for the sort of moderate scale operations, generally concentrated in the northern part of the state. And then when we looked at the ideal location for that large scale production facility, we found that one particular area sort of rose above the rest, and that was Española, sort of mitigating costs and increasing the amount of potential inputs, right? So there's a lot of factors that went into that, right? Cheap land, close distance to both agricultural sites for depositing the biochar, and then close proximity to forest where the biomass would be coming from. So again, this table can be found in the publication where we list all of these. And collectively, we estimated that medium scale facilities could process upwards. So again, this isn't an individual facility. This is all of them. About 108,000 tons of biomass into about 22,000 tons of biochar. And then we've got the large ones that would produce convert about the same, right? So the 20 moderate scale ones collectively could process about the same amount as that single large one. The biggest costs associated with the biochar production were transportation of biomass. That consisted of about 13% of costs. That was particularly true for that large scale centralized production facility. But then that centralized production facility had lower storage costs. So there's some trade-offs there. And then when sort of evaluating the economic impact there, we particularly looked at employment. And there's not a whole lot of great data out there to base this off of. It's sort of back of the envelope, I will admit. But between 25 to 30 FTE positions could be a result from this type of development. Now, we mentioned earlier on that people were interested in financial incentives, and certainly there are funding sources to produce biochar. So the U.S. Forest Service has funding through the Inflation Reduction Act. We'll see how much longer that lasts, as well as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Acts to incentivize the production of non-timber forest products from waste wood, from thinning operations. So things like the Wood Innovations Grants Program, which could cover up to 50% of the cost of a biochar processing facility. There are relatively few pilot projects that have actually benefited from these funding sources. And to this end, there is a bill, so the Biochar Research Network Act, that has been introduced to advance biochar research, including economic analyses. So that's sort of the research component. And then the Biochar Act, which is a separate bill that aims to use thin material from national forest management in demonstration projects that would be housed in each of the U.S. Forest Service regions. So we've got potential funding there. The NRCS program also offers funding to produce and apply biochar through a couple of their conservation stewardship programs, namely, I'm trying to remember the codes. Let me check my notes here. E384A for those interested, and E336. So that's biochar production from woody residue and soil carbon amendments. So those are the two conservation stewardship programs that would provide funding. And those are really targeted at individual land managements. However, when we got in touch with the NRCS, at least here in New Mexico, Mexico. I haven't looked at this sort of more broadly. In New Mexico, so far, no contracts regarding biochar have been awarded, right? So even though there's that opportunity, nobody's really taken them up on that offer. And so that's at the federal level. If we look at the state level, um, the 2020 New Mexico Forest Action Plan specifically identifies the establishment of biochar facilities and markets as an opportunity to make use of small diameter woody debris from forest management activities. Um, but beyond there, so there's this broad intention there, but there's been really limited action and follow through to sort of pursue that intention. And there's also uncertainty about what sort of state policies would regulate biochar production. So, as some of you may know, we've got the Prescribed Burning Act that passed the New Mexico legislature back in 2021. And that was meant to establish a negligence standard for prescribed burning on private lands. It put a model for burn permits. It had an incentivized training and certification program for landowners that would teach them how to conduct prescribed burns safely. Now, that act defines burning as the controlled application of fire to achieve natural resource management objectives. Biochar production involves fire to achieve natural resource management objectives. So it seems like biochar production would fall under the purview of that act. But arguably biochar production is very different than burning waste from Masaikia cleanings or doing a pile burn. There is a very different set of risks and a different set of processes. And so there's a lot of question as to whether biochar does in fact fall under the Prescribed Burning Act. There's not a real, different people who I've spoken to have sort of different interpretations of that. And then two, whether or not it should. And so ultimately, maybe it falls under other regulations that are sort of addressing other agricultural burning practices. That's under the purview of the New Mexico Environment Department. So, really at the state level, what would be really helpful here is clearer guidance about the liability that individuals would incur or groups would incur as a result of producing biochar from forest thinning activities, what sort of protections and incentives they would be eligible for. And then I think to address that education or the knowledge gap, what sort of training or certification opportunities could we develop to produce biochar effectively and safely and really empower people to do this? Because the interest is certainly there. There's just not necessarily a confidence to be able to do so effectively and safely. And so that sort of wraps up what the team has done up to this point. And now there is some interest in thinking about biochar application in some of some unique sort of places. So specifically looking at using biochar as a growth medium for seedlings for reforestation efforts. So right now, most production facilities use sphagnum moss, which is both economically costly and has a lot of environmental consequences, negative environmental consequences associated with its extraction. So could we be doing that from a locally produced source more cheaply and with less environmental consequences? And how would that influence outplanting success? Because again, there's that water holding capacity, there's soil health benefits. Would that improve outplanting success in these reforestation efforts, which is, generally actually quite low. These are very harsh environmental conditions that we're putting these little plants into. And certainly we can do some of that, or address some of that by really sort of training them in a greenhouse, drought conditioning them, things like that. But ultimately, maybe biochar could give them a little bit of a leg up when they're being put into that context. So just to wrap up, as I mentioned, there's a lot of enthusiasm, there's a lot of interest. We need to bridge those gaps by providing people with the resources, both in terms of informational resources, financial resources to support the adoption of biochar production here in northern New Mexico. But there's no one size fits all solutions. There's some general rules of thumb that I think are useful, right? People seems to be generally interested in things that are lower cost, sort of DIY things, and maybe at a larger scale, something that's more centralized. And New Mexico offers some unique challenges and opportunities compared to the rest of the Intermountain West, right? That sort of concern about fire, some of the regulations surrounding fire at the state level, all these things come into play. And sort of the last question that I have here is, all right, so at least in theory, there's this interest. If we build it, will they come? And there's really, looking at the literature, there's sort of mixed results there. It's often described as a fallacy when it comes to environmental management, or a myth of environmental management, that there's sort of this, if you just set the stage, things will take care of themselves. But what we also demonstrated is that maybe that, you need to have that in place. And then there's a question of how do you actually bring people to engage with it at that point, and that's another set of questions. So, with that, I think we've got about 15 minutes or so for questions, and I welcome them. Thank you.
Great. That was awesome, Tomasz. You covered a huge range succinctly. And we've gotten some good conversations sort of started in the chat, and I'll try to pull those out. But feel free to add more.
Mhm.
So I put the links to your papers in there. I think if people need the full version, you should probably email Tomasz. And so one thing that came up was, I think more on the sort of practicality that, feel free to defer if you don't feel like you want to wade into that, Tomasz. But Melissa was asking, working on a particular site, if you don't have easily available water source for that sort of Cavera Coalition Ring of Fire top lit approach. Do you have any comments there? And I do want to recognize that Carl said, "Hey, burn with a little bit of snow on the ground." But
Yeah, I mean, as a practical consideration, that's one option. I think that is relevant. Um, the other thing that I'll say is that I would argue that biochar has a lot of hype around it, and I certainly am a big advocate for biochar, as the my research would suggest. I think it's a really important tool to have in our land management toolbox. However, I think that it's also important to acknowledge that it's context dependent, and it is not a silver bullet. It's, I'm not going to be the hammer that sees everything as a nail, or I don't know how but where biochar fits into that metaphor, whether it's the hammer or the nail or whatever. But the point being that I don't, maybe rethink about like whether or not biochar production is going to be an applicable strategy for that kind of area. I think that's, and saying maybe not, I think that's fine, right? I don't want to, as much as I do want people to think about it and to encourage people to do it, I don't want to evangelize it as like, okay, everyone needs to start producing biochar in every single situation.
yeah, and I'll also note we did some research with Santa Clara Pueblo on just pile burning, sort of the standard practice, at least if they're hand-built piles, so relatively small. You're producing, and I forget the numbers because the project is a little bit older, but we identify like how much biochar was being produced just from those piles, like in a normal
Yep.
sort of pile burning. So it may
Yeah.
be that rather than seeing like, oh, we gotta take a sort of production biochar production to remote sites, maybe that's a pile burn site, and maybe that there are other areas where it makes more sense to pull that stuff in. Um,
Absolutely. And I'll just say,
yeah.
you alluded to my work on Swidden agriculture in Chiapas, and that's really how I got into the biochar world, was looking at biochar conversion in those Swidens where, again, they're not quenching this, they're not putting it into a kiln, right? This is a broadcast burn that is still producing biochar. And yes, admittedly, the conversion efficiency from biomass to biochar is decidedly lower than you would have in a unit where that pyrolysis is really being facilitated. But yeah, as you point out, there is still biochar that is being produced, and that's a good thing.
Yep. Karsten was talking a little bit about the use of the burn boss, the towable sort of unit, and I think we could delve into that a little bit if folks are interested. I also want to call out maybe directly for Tomasz. Have you shared your results, this conversation with the Mexico legislature, folks at State Forestry working on the Forest Action Plan, et cetera?
I have not, and this is despite my sort of fairly shallow dive into, I'm not a policy guy necessarily. But I think that that's a deficiency many of us in the academy have, which is that, okay, the end goal is this paper, and then it just sort of goes out into the ether and we expect people to find it on their own. And so that's a really good suggestion, and I appreciate that. I should do that.
Well, and also there are folks on this call, um, like Forest Stewards Guild, that's a little bit more in the kind of work we do. And I think this webinar is a good step. I didn't look at the full list, but we may even have some folks from State Forestry on. So um, we could start that process. Let's see. Paul asked about whether that old Duke City lumber facility at Espanola was, where you honed in, or whether was it more general, just sort of Espanola in general.
Yeah, it's much more general than that. I forget the exact. So basically, how it works is we divided the entire state into a grid, and then I forget the exact dimensions of the grid, but it's certainly not a fine enough
Yeah.
resolution to be able to pinpoint like this lot. It was much more general than that. Yeah.
And then John Hyatt mentioned a demonstration project in Nevada. And I wonder, John, if you could either unmute and share a little bit, or maybe in the chat have put a link. It's always interesting to see other examples, demonstration projects. My sense is there's a lot happening all across the country. And in order to get this right, we need to learn from other folks. So that would be useful. And everyone,
So,
oh, go ahead.
yeah, I'll reply to that. This was done by the Eastern Nevada Landscape Coalition, working with some other partners. And we concluded that with a large amount of relatively fine fuels, basically stuff less than 2 inches in diameter, and the amount of work of putting that into a kiln, burning it, and then spreading it out, that the cost just didn't make sense for us to do that. And we're talking about thousands of acres here of land with pinyon juniper woodlands that need some thinning and some work. And just the, the facilities available and the labor involved, it just didn't work for us.
Yeah, and I mean that may be true, and context matters, as I've said before. And the other thing that I'll say is that that was a challenge that we identified. Zender, you mentioned the burn boss, and there's I think sort of a sort of a technology issue that we run into with biochar when we talk about scale is that to be able to process large amounts of slash, the startup and the level of sort of industrial,
Mhm.
infrastructure that needs to be put into place is often prohibitive. And so, I think that's part of why, I think this needs to be a part of a sort of a suite of strategies that are going to be contingent on, the different contexts and where it's applied. I think that there are some interesting new technologies. Someone at the fire conference, Xander actually mentioned, I think it was called like the burn box or something like that. That was again, I didn't know about it before they mentioned, which again is sort of burn boss or char boss sized. But again, processing large amounts of slash is difficult, and I don't think that, I'm not trying to suggest that this is going to be the only way in which we process slash. I should add that as a caveat. I totally think that this is a complementary strategy that sort of fills a niche in certain sensitive areas where the risk associated with pile burns or broadcast burns would be very high. So that's the sort of situation in which I can see this doing, not treating, thousands of acres necessarily.
Yeah, right, that complementarity of solutions. Let's see, Naomi was asking about the maximum distance from supply that you kind of built into the model.
There wasn't a max distance. The way that we calculated it was, again, we sort of looked at those individual grids and saying, okay, to get from grid point A to grid point B, how much would that cost? And so basically that was just a cost that would count against, and the bigger the distance, the greater the cost, so that the more it sort of would be counted against for that model point. So it wasn't like, okay, if it's more than 200 miles, no go. It was more that, all right, let's consider the entire range, because certainly, if there's enough sort of biomass available there, and the road infrastructure is good enough, maybe it makes sense, right? And so rather than do the cutoff, we sort of tried to look at that a little bit more holistically, perhaps.
Yeah, I know there some other folks working in sort of implementation here. And Kirsten, I wonder if you wanted to just mention some of the thinking that North Fork Advisors has put into using the burn boss out in the woods.
I'd be happy to. Um, okay, so I'll talk. Thank you all seeing my face. So my name is Kirsten. I'm a guild member. I'm also on the board and starting a company in Colorado outside of Denver that is looking at optimizing different biochar solutions on the Front Range. So a lot of what Thomas has said is it informed a lot of our work kind of on the Colorado side, and we've looked at, centralized forest campus, sort of forest products campuses along the Front Range. But what we're really focused on right now is we have a burn boss, which is a mobile piece of equipment that we can pull around on a trailer. We selected that because it is mobile, and because the payload that a Ford 350 can carry, in addition to the water, which is, I think, also what somebody asked about. And what we are finding, at least on the Front Range in Colorado, is that its throughput is about 6 tons of biomass for every 3 hours. It's a batch, and you can do 3 batches in a day. So compared to mastication or compared to slash pile burning, it's not as quick in terms of getting everybody organized. And just, the operations crew. So that I think has sort of been just one of our biggest challenges, is aligning the time with the production. Other than that, we have found that it's a really agile machine. On the permitting side, there's some air emissions hurdles that have to be overcome. But it's nifty. That's my good forestry business word. It's nifty. It's a nifty little guy, with lots of applications. So I'm happy to have, way more conversations. We've done a lot of kind of just vertical studies looking at biochar production, carbon credits from biochar, CDRs in Colorado and New Mexico, kind of in the, mobilizing capital side. That's the biggest constraint right now. But I'm learning a lot, so I'm happy to share if anyone wants to.
Great.
Can
Yeah, I think that's maybe Tomasz will give you the last word, but I think there's a lot of potential for folks on this call just to keep these conversations going, because I think Tomasz and his team have done some good foundational work that science is important to sort of justify further exploration. And I know there are a lot of you all trying out different pieces of this puzzle, and it feels like we're getting close, but nothing has quite turned the corner. But Tomasz will give you the last word, and then we'll round up for today.
I think and thank you, Kirsten, for the white paper that you shared, because I'm excited to read that. It must have come out, I'm seeing July, so shortly after we published ours. But thank you for that. And I guess the last thing that I'll just say is that sometimes I wonder if we tend to get in sort of an optimization trap, where people always want to do, the ideal thing and the best. And certainly, ultimately we ran an optimization model to try to find the best sites, right? But also, I don't want that to sort of get in the way, or sort of paralyze action, and that, it whether we're doing this at a small scale or at a larger scale, I see benefits to it depending on the situation. And I don't want to say, like, minimize the work that folks are doing with just like small 55-gallon drum kilns, right? To say, okay, we can't, that's not going to cut it. That's valuable. And if that helps people motivate action, and if this is at all helpful, right? That's wonderful. So
Perfect way to end. Thank you so much, and thanks for a wonderful presentation. Thanks everyone for joining, and look forward to connecting on future events and conversations. Have a great day.